All right, this is a case study related to the Westboro Baptist Church. This case study is found in the egotism section of the course, and even more specifically, the radical egotism section of the course. So we're studying this case in order to understand what egotism is, and even more specifically, what radical egotism is. Now, an objection related to this case would be, well, look, this is not an example of radical egotism. And I'll get into that later in the video. Okay, but what is the case? What's happening here? Well, this essentially comes from a news report that involves an estranged son of this man, Fred Phelps. So the estranged son, used to be part of the family and used to be part of the religious congregation that Fred Phelps led. Now, he talks about his father, and he's very critical of his father, and he thinks his father is evil. But what is his father doing? Why are we talking about it in this class? Well, the Westboro Baptist Church was very famous because they would go to the funerals of soldiers, American soldiers, that had died in battle and protested. So this church and Fred Phelps and his congregation would go to these funerals, and they would hold up signs, and they would make a big scene. And on these signs would be things like, "Thank God your son is dead," or "God hates fags," or "Thank God for dead soldiers." And so you can imagine why this would be a form of radical egotism. You are a family member, a friend, a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, a brother, a sister, and you're going to this funeral, and you have these people here saying, "Thank God your son, your daughter, your father, your mother, whatever, is dead." So obviously you could see how that would be incredibly hurtful, incredibly disrespectful. Here's this guy coming into to the funeral, a time that is supposed to be sacred, a time that is set aside for nothing other than these family and friends to say goodbye to this person whom they were connected with, whom they presumably loved. And you have this now becoming a circus. Media would come. You would gain a lot of attention. And you also have a strand of radical egotism in terms of Fred Phelps arguably using the people at the funeral to advance his own sociopolitical kind of agenda, to advance his own vision of the good life, or perhaps simply to gain fame and attention for himself and for his congregation. One could also argue that Fred Phelps would be a radical egotist because he's playing God. He's kind of making God's judgment for God. He becomes the God, he becomes the judge, he becomes the determiner of who is going to heaven and hell, and what exactly is going to get you in and prevent you from going. So in all these cases, or in all these examples, or in all these interpretations of his action, you can see how Fred Phelps could be considered a radical egotist. He is going into this sacred time in order to make a point, and he's doing it in a way that is disturbing, that is harmful, upsetting to the people that are in there, and perhaps he's just doing it for his own agenda or his own fame. Now, another component of this story, and we find this out from Fred Phelps' estranged son in the interview, is that he makes the charge that his father also beat his brothers and his sisters, and so his father was abusive. And you could certainly put abuse, familial abuse, abuse of children, child abuse, in the category of radical egotism. For there's no reason to beat a child. And so that, to being willing to harm a child in that way, you could say you're only concerned about yourself or your kind of agenda or your form of discipline or whatever. But, I'll put aside the child abuse because that can be a little bit more complicated. And really the central issue here is the homosexuality and his protest of the homosexuality. That's what he's really known for. Now, when we come to the objection, it's a little bit different than the case studies we looked at, or one of the case studies that we looked at in the murder section, where people murder others in order to advance their agenda, in order to achieve their desire. In that case, really there's no argument against the fact that this was radically egotistic. The only question is whether they knew what they were doing, were they insane, and so therefore maybe they weren't morally responsible. Or you could take the position of a subjective individual relativist, where it's just the individual's opinion that matters, and so there is no real right and wrong. But in this case, what is the difference here? So in this case, one could object, not only is he not responsible, one could argue that he's actually doing something good. One could argue that far from being a radical egotist, he's actually a complete altruist. He's actually driven by compassion and love for others. Now, at this point, you might stop and say, there's absolutely no way this guy could be considered compassionate or kind or respectful or altruistic, because he's going to these funerals and doing things that are going to be incredibly upsetting to the people that are there. How could he care about others if he's there upsetting these others? What's the case? What's the argument? What's the objection? Well, the objection is something like the following. The objection is that he is doing this because he wants to save people from hell. The objection is that, look, in his religious interpretation, in his religious tradition, you are going to hell. Not only if you support homosexuality or homosexual yourself, but merely by not denouncing homosexuality. And that's why he was going, and I should make this point as well, that's why he was going to these funerals. It's not because these soldiers were themselves gay. I mean, some of them could have been. He was going to these funerals under the pretext that they were defending a nation that was lost, a nation that had completely denied the will of God, that rejected the will of God. And so these soldiers were protecting this hellbound nation, this nation that is completely secular, that was completely permissive of any kind of sexual kind of action and lifestyle. And so his protest against the soldiers is really a protest against America. Now, if you go with the objection, you say he's really compassionate, he really loves people. The objection is based on the idea that he wants to save people from hell. He wants to save America from hell, you might say. And you can actually further this objection and say, not only is he not a radical egotist, he's the essence of a complete altruist, because he's willing to accept all the hatred, all the hate speech that's going to be shouted his way, all the ostracism, all the anger, all the loathing, all the disgust that is going to be directed toward him and his congregation. You say he's willing to do that because he's so dedicated to saving people from hell. He's willing to take on all this hatred, all this anger, all this isolation in order to save this country from the torments of the devil. And you could say, look, it's not about him advancing an agenda, his personal agenda, or getting famous. It's about him spreading this message that will save humanity and save America. Okay, so that's how one could essentially make the objection. Now, the rebuttal is that, look, that is not true. That is not in keeping with his character. His character is one where it's just about him. And I think obviously there's a very strong case to be made that he is a radical egotist, and that the idea that he's doing this really for others, rather than someone who's doing it to play God, or rather than doing it, because he can, because he just wants to advance his position. There's plenty of evidence that that's his true character. And one final thing before I close off this video, and it relates to another way of kind of objecting, another way one could potentially defend Phelps. One might say something like the following: well, look, this is temporary pain that he's causing, but in his defense, he's trying to save people from eternal torment. So yeah, the temporary pain sucks. It's going to be hard. It's going to be awful for these people that have to endure his protests. But, it's temporary and not a big deal when you compare it to the bigger picture and what you're talking about, saving people from eternal damnation forever. You would be suffering in hell. And he might also say something like, look, I get it, these methods are not maybe the ideal, but they're the only way to spread this message. Because if I just say homosexuality is wrong, or you shouldn't do it, or God hates it, nobody's going to pay attention. You have to do something that grabs attention and brings people to the issue. Now, Again, I think there's plenty of reason to offer rebuttal here, plenty of reason to think that he's not actually doing this because he's concerned, with regard to the whole issue of method, like this is the only method. One could argue that, look, if that's the only method, then you shouldn't do it. And in fact, if that's the only method, you're not going to turn people onto your message. In fact, you're going to have the opposite effect. So one might argue from a purely practical perspective that making your case in this way, pushing your agenda in this way, is actually going to turn people off. It's going to make people less likely to reject homosexuality or something like that. Okay, so again, big picture here. Fred Phelps, head of the Westboro Baptist Church, he's going to these funerals, he's protesting. The case that he's a radical egotist is that he's disrupting this time that is absolutely sacred and important, and doing so is just, regardless of what other objectives he's going to pursue, wrong and egotistic. You don't do this to other people, and you don't use people to promote a message, no matter how valuable that message might be in your own mind. And I think you can also say, look, this is potentially an instance of a guy who's not, taking it for the team, not taking it for the message, but a guy who really wants to play God. A guy who wants people to serve him. A guy who thinks that his judgment of either certain issues or religion in general is identical with the divine. If Fred Phelps thinks you're going to hell, then that's the same as God thinking you're going to hell. Okay, so more complex than the murder case studies. But it does kind of develop this notion of what radical egotism could look like, as well as how radical egotism, you could potentially make the objection that in this case it's a form of complete altruism. All right.